He used to be the man who helped hundreds of people overcome their emotional wounds. But for 10 years, he didn't say a single word to anyone. And yet, because of a messy little drawing from a 7-year-old girl, he began to step out of that room. No one could have imagined that what brought him back to life came from a single father who had no idea who he was. If someone asked Aiden what the strangest thing he'd ever witnessed was, he'd probably tell them about that moment when a man who hadn't spoken in years suddenly began to talk because of a child. And not long after that, that same old man would completely change the course of Aiden's life. But to understand why, we have to go back to before it all began. Back when everything in Aiden's life was still ordinary. So ordinary that no one really noticed. Aiden Moore was the kind of person you could see every day and still never really remember his face. Early 30s, light brown hair, a slim build, and plain t-shirts that always seemed a little wrinkled around the sleeves. He lived in the northern suburbs, a place of low-rise houses, an old gas station, and a breakfast diner that closed exactly at 11. He didn't have much time to think about haircuts or holiday schedules. His job as an air conditioning repair technician kept him busy almost every day, moving from house to building, sometimes crawling through basements or climbing rooftops in the scorching summer heat. But no matter how tired he was, there was one thing he always made sure to do before leaving home. Pack a lunchbox for his daughter, Callie, age 7. 2 slices of peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a small handwritten note. "I'll pick you up on time, like Superman." 4 years ago, Callie's mother left. Not because Aiden was a bad man, but because she couldn't stand the feeling of being trapped in a life that was all about getting by. She once wanted to live big, while Aiden just wanted peace. One morning, she left a note and her wedding ring on the sink. From that day on, everything changed, but Aiden never let Callie feel unloved. He never spoke badly about her mother. He only told Callie, "You and I are a superhero team, strong enough to get through anything." Money was always a struggle. After paying rent, gas, Callie's seasonal allergy medicine, and small expenses, Aiden was left with less than $200 a month. But he never complained. As long as his daughter could sleep safely each night, have a warm breakfast, and a few books to read, he felt luckier than most. One of Aiden's regular jobs was at a nursing home at the end of an old street. A 3-story building with peeling cream paint, the smell of disinfectant, and the soft creak of wind slipping through wooden window frames. The air conditioning system there was ancient, so it needed weekly checkups. Most of the staff already knew him. They called him the quiet repair guy. Aiden didn't talk much, but he was always on time, worked neatly, carefully, and never complained when asked to fix a few extra things not listed in the contract. For Aiden, every job was worth doing if it brought someone a little comfort, even if it just made an old person's room 2 degrees cooler. One afternoon, while checking the cooling unit on the 2nd floor, Aiden heard someone coughing down the hallway. When he turned around, he saw an elderly man with silver hair sitting alone in a wheelchair, fumbling through his shirt pocket for something. There were no nurses nearby. No one seemed to notice. Aiden walked over and gently asked, "Do you need any help, sir?" The old man didn't answer, but his eyes, there was something in them, a mix of exhaustion and something else, like shyness tangled with self-defense. Aiden didn't press further. He simply bent down, picked up a small pill box lying near the man's foot, and placed it carefully into his frail hand. No one knew it then, but that was the first time in over 18 months that Harvey Elridge had allowed another person to touch him without pulling away. That day, after helping Mr. Elridge pick up the fallen pill bottle, Aiden thought he'd just go back to his work as usual. But he didn't. He'd taken a step forward, one he didn't even realize. After finishing the inspection of the 2nd floor air system, he walked back down the hallway and saw the old man still sitting there in silence. His thin fingers were turning a small bottle of eye drops over and over in his palm, holding it as if it were the only thing left that reminded him he was still alive. For some reason, Aiden found himself walking closer again. He knelt down, careful to keep a respectful distance so the old man wouldn't feel uncomfortable. "How long have you been using this, sir?" he asked. Mr. Elridge still didn't answer, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, more like he was deciding whether to let someone hear his voice at all. "I used to use this for my dad. It stings the eyes if it's left out in the open too long," Aiden added, his voice low so no one else would hear. Mr. Elridge finally spoke, hoarse and broken. "It's dry. I can't find a new bottle anywhere." Aiden looked at his hand, then into the worn coat pocket. There was no other bottle. The old man was panicked, though not loudly like some people. A nurse came over about to ask, but he turned his face away. She sighed, shook her head, and whispered to Aiden, "He never lets anyone help, unless you know something I don't." Then she walked off, leaving a thin, fragile silence between the two men of different generations. Aiden stood up and said to Mr. Elridge, "I'll head to the pharmacy nearby for a minute. If they have any, I'll bring back a new bottle." 15 minutes later, Aiden returned with a small paper bag. The pharmacy had first refused to sell anything without an official order from the nursing home. But after Aiden briefly explained the old man's condition, the pharmacist agreed to sell a single bottle at full price. Aiden paid out of his own pocket, then came back and placed the new bottle into those trembling hands. Neither of them said a word. But from that moment on, every week when Aiden came to the nursing home, Mr. Elridge would open his window before he arrived. A few weeks later, Aiden began to notice something small. There was always something slightly broken in Mr. Elridge's room. Sometimes a crooked light switch, other times a squeaky door hinge. Nothing serious, but just enough to make him stay a few minutes after finishing his regular work. Each time, he'd say only one thing. "Everything okay today, sir?" And even if the old man didn't answer, Aiden would start fixing things as if he'd been invited in. Once, Mr. Elridge gave a slight nod instead of staying silent. For Aiden, that single nod was enough. It meant the old man didn't mind his presence. Callie once asked her dad, "Why do you visit that silver-haired man's room every week?" Aiden just smiled. "Because sometimes people need to know someone still remembers them." She didn't ask further, just nodded and drew an old man with a long beard in the corner of her Elsa drawing. One of the nurses quietly told Aiden after his shift, "His name's Dr. Harvey Elridge. He used to be someone well known, I think in medicine or psychology or something like that. About 10 years ago, he suddenly gave everything up, sold his house, and asked to live here voluntarily. No visitors, no letters, no friends. We figured he chose this life to disappear." Aiden wasn't curious. He didn't need to know who the old man used to be. What mattered to him was that every time he walked into the room, the light in Mr. Elridge's eyes seemed a little less cold. Sometimes, while Aiden was fixing a hinge or replacing a curtain cord, the old man would stare out the window for a long time, as if trying to hear the echoes of a life that had gone silent. Aiden never intruded on that space. He was just there. What he brought wasn't advice or pity. It was simply the steady rhythm of someone still living. And sometimes, that's enough to make another person want to live again. The more often Aiden came to the nursing home, the more he sensed something different about Mr. Elridge. Not the kind of different that comes from being strange or hard to understand, but the quietness of someone who once belonged to noisy rooms and then chose to walk away from all the sound. Weekends were when Aiden usually stopped by the nursing home to finish up small repair jobs he hadn't managed to do during the week. And since he couldn't find anyone to watch Callie on those days, he started bringing her along. She was such a well-behaved kid that the staff sometimes even asked her to keep an eye on one of the confused elderly ladies when they were short-handed. Callie always carried a small backpack filled with colored pencils, a few storybooks, and 2 packs of cookies. While Aiden worked, she'd sit in the hallway or a waiting room corner, legs swinging, coloring quietly. The first time Mr. Elridge saw her, he only glanced through the half-open door. He didn't say a word, but Aiden noticed. He set his book down earlier than usual and sat in silence a little longer than usual. One afternoon, while Aiden was replacing an old set of wires on the second floor, Callie sat drawing right outside Mr. Elridge's door. Her picture was a strange little world, a purple castle, a blue-haired princess, and an old man with silver hair and round glasses standing beside a man holding a screwdriver. "What's that?" a deep but not unfriendly voice asked. Callie looked up, not scared, just smiling. "It's my dad and my dad's friend. The old man looks a little sad, but he's still kind of cute." Mr. Elridge stared at the drawing for a long moment. His expression didn't change, but his hand trembled slightly as he took the paper Callie offered. "Did I draw better than my dad?" she asked. The old man's mouth twitched into a faint smile. "By a mile." From that day on, every time Aiden brought Callie along, Mr. Elridge would either open his window or leave his door slightly ajar. When Callie sat nearby, he'd ask her what she'd learned at school, what her teacher was like, or why the princesses in fairy tales always wore such long dresses. The questions were light and simple, but for the first time in years, they were questions meant for someone other than himself. Aiden never interfered in those conversations. He just let them unfold naturally, as if nothing special was happening. But to him, every time he saw Mr. Elridge rest his frail hand on one of Callie's drawings or pour her a glass of water himself, he knew something inside the old man was shifting. Not long after, Mr. Elridge began talking more to Aiden this time. At first it was small talk. What's for lunch today? Why'd you come early this week? But soon it turned into bits and pieces of stories that seemed random, almost meaningless. Once he told Aiden about nearly getting food poisoning from seafood in a port city back east. Another time, he mentioned losing his wallet in a park up north, and how a stranger's little boy found it and returned it to him. The stories sounded like they were falling out of some forgotten drawer in his mind, old, scattered, but told in a slow, precise voice full of unspoken meaning. Once he mentioned a woman who had written to him for 3 years, every letter containing just one sentence: "I'm still alive, and I'm still trying." Aiden didn't pry. He never asked Mr. Elridge about his past, about why he was there, or about the years before. He just listened. Sometimes, while tightening a door hinge, he'd hear the old man talk about a saxophone player in Louisiana who once gave him the worst advice of his life. Other times, Mr. Elridge would stop mid-sentence as if something caught in his throat, then quietly say, "Never mind." Aiden understood. Some things didn't need to be spoken. Some parts of a person's story could only be filled by another's quiet presence. One Saturday afternoon, as Aiden was packing up his tools, Mr. Elridge stood at his doorway, arms crossed, voice rough but steady. "You know," he said, "you're the only one here who doesn't look at me like an old piece of furniture." Aiden paused for a second, turned back, and simply said, "I don't think you're a piece of anything, sir." Mr. Elridge glanced down the hall, where Callie was drawing a picture titled "The House That Smiles." "That," he said softly, "is why I keep my door open every week." Even though Mr. Elridge had started talking more, there was still a quiet distance between him and Aiden. It wasn't hesitation. It was a kind of understanding that didn't require intrusion. Each man kept his boundaries, yet somehow they managed to walk part of the road side by side. Maybe that's why that particular afternoon left such a different feeling in Aiden's chest. The seasons were beginning to change, and as usual, Aiden brought Callie along for the weekend visit. She carried her new box of colored pencils and excitedly told Mr. Elridge she'd just learned how to draw with light and shading. While Aiden was busy fixing an outlet on the 3rd floor, Callie sat in Mr. Elridge's room, working on a new picture. She turned to grab another pencil and accidentally knocked over a photo frame sitting on the shelf by his bed. The glass didn't break, but the latch came loose, and the photograph inside slipped gently onto the floor. Callie hurried to pick it up. She was about to set it back when she froze, staring at the photograph. In it was a young man with bright eyes holding a little boy, no more than 4 years old, standing beside a much younger-looking Mr. Elridge. Their eyes weren't on the camera. They were on each other, smiling softly. Callie handed the photo to him. "I'm sorry. I dropped it." Mr. Elridge took the frame without a word. His eyes locked on the picture, and for a moment it felt like all the sound had been drained from the room. Just then, Aiden walked in and noticed the heavy silence, something unusual even for Mr. Elridge. He was about to say something when the old man spoke first, his voice slow and unsteady. "I once had a family like yours, but I lost them in a way I never saw coming." Aiden didn't say anything. He just sat down on the small chair beside the bed, his eyes shifting toward the photo. Mr. Elridge set the frame back on the table and turned toward the window. "My son's name was Spencer," he began. "He was a painter, not famous, not stable, but full of passion. He lived more by instinct than logic. Every day was a new color to him." His voice wasn't sad or self-pitying. It sounded like someone quietly rereading a chapter they'd once closed too quickly. "I could never understand him. He thought I was cold. Spencer once told me, 'You can heal strangers, but you've never learned how to talk to your own son.'" Aiden stayed silent. He wasn't sure if he had any right to step into a memory like that. Mr. Elridge went on. "We started arguing more and more. Every little thing turned into something big. I told him he should learn a trade, get insurance, think about a pension. He told me I was good at making everything meaningless. And then one day, he left. No note, No calls, just gone. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I thought he'd come back, a week, a month, a year. But then one night the phone rang. It was the hospital. Spencer had been in a car accident on the interstate. When they brought him into the ER, he didn't have any ID, just a torn sketch in his wallet. He paused. They kept the body for 2 days before finding me through an old email address he'd left somewhere. Aiden clenched his hands together. He'd heard plenty of heartbreaking stories in his work, but something in the way Mr. Elridge spoke sent a sharp ache straight through his chest. I got there too late. Spencer was already gone. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to fix. His voice came out rough, almost a whisper. For years, I held on to the hope that someday there'd be a chance to make peace, to apologize, to have one last conversation. But it turns out, that was just something I imagined I still had the right to wait for. He turned his head toward Aiden. His eyes held no tears, only emptiness. I used to help people face their pain, but I never realized the deepest wound was sitting right inside my own home. Aiden didn't speak. He knew that feeling, the ache of looking back and wondering if things could have been different. The silence he kept wasn't because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood that no words could ever be enough. And sometimes, silence is the language of people who have been broken in the same way. Callie stood by the door. She didn't understand everything, but she could feel the strange sadness hanging in the room. She walked over to Mr. Elridge and gently took his hand. If I were your granddaughter, she said softly, I'd come back. Mr. Elridge looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he reached out and stroked Callie's hair, awkwardly, as if he'd forgotten how to do it long ago. I wish Spencer had a daughter like you, he said, his voice just loud enough for both Aiden and Callie to hear, and for himself to finally hear it too. A week after that afternoon when Mr. Elridge told the story about Spencer, Aiden had an accident. It was a Tuesday morning. He was fixing an air conditioning unit on the roof of a small guest house when his foot slipped on a wet steel beam. He fell onto the concrete floor below, not high enough to be life-threatening, but hard enough to fracture his ankle and dislocate his shoulder. The doctor told him he'd need to rest for at least 3 weeks, maybe longer if he moved the wrong way. It was the first time in years Aiden had to stay still and do nothing. He didn't have full work insurance, and even a single week without income was enough to throw his entire budget into chaos. Everything in his life had been planned down to the dollar. Rent, Callie's allergy meds, their weekly groceries. And now, every number on that list had to shrink and shift just to make it through. Callie was the one who noticed her dad sitting motionless in the kitchen for a long time after making a call to the power company. She brought him a drawing. I drew a flying air conditioner. Feel better now, Dad? Aiden smiled, but his chest felt heavy, like it was filled with lead. 2 days later, on a warm, sunny afternoon, the nursing home called Aiden's house. The receptionist's voice was polite. Mr. Moore, would you be able to receive a visitor? He's one of our residents, but he's requested a special day pass to go out. Aiden asked, Who is it? The voice on the other end answered gently, Dr. Harvey Elridge. He said you might need some company. An hour later, a small silver car pulled up in front of Aiden's apartment. The door opened, and Mr. Elridge, wearing a light brown wool coat and soft orthopedic shoes, carefully stepped out with the help of a nursing home attendant. He was holding a small paper bag, and there was something different about his eyes compared to the last time Aiden had seen him. Lighter somehow, but as if he was bracing himself against that very lightness. I didn't think you'd actually come, Aiden said, helping him inside. Well, you took quite a fall, didn't you? Mr. Elridge muttered, half teasing, half serious. Sounds like that air conditioner won the first round. The apartment where Aiden and Callie lived was barely over 400 square feet, 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a study corner built from plywood panels. Everything was tidy, but worn with time. The family picture hanging on the wall was one of Callie's drawings, 3 people holding hands under an orange sun. Mr. Elridge sat down in a chair and placed the paper bag on the table. Inside were a few boxes of easy-to-heat meals, a jar of ginger honey, and a fresh pack of coloring books. That's not for you, he said as Callie ran over and eagerly peeked inside. I owe the young lady at least 1 box of crayons. When Callie dashed off to her room with her new gift, Mr. Elridge looked around the apartment again. His eyes settled on the drawing still lying unfinished on the table. A picture of an old man with silver hair and a sweater, smiling, with the messy words written beside him. Grandpa Harvey. He sat still, saying nothing, but his hands were clenched tight. His eyes turned red, and it took him a while before he could speak. I thought I'd never feel this again, he said quietly. The feeling of being thought of. Not for a name, not for a past, but simply because you exist. That evening, he asked to stay the night. Aiden hesitated, but Callie lit up instantly. You can sleep on my chair. I'll bring you my softest pillow, she said excitedly. Aiden set up a spot for Mr. Frau Elridge on the sofa, adding an extra blanket to keep the chill off his back. The old man didn't protest. He just smiled and said, I thought I'd gotten used to a hospital bed. But it turns out a house with the sound of a child in it beats all the quiet in the world. As night fell, the air turned colder. Aiden couldn't sleep well. The dull ache in his shoulder kept him awake. Around 3 a.m, he got up to take his medication and saw a figure standing out on the porch. It was Mr. Elridge, wrapped in an extra coat, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't flinch when Aiden opened the door, as if he'd already known someone would come out. I haven't slept well since Spencer died, he said, eyes fixed on the empty courtyard ahead. Every night it's the same. I wake up halfway through, my heart racing, and one question keeps looping in my head. If I'd said something different that day, would things have changed? Aiden didn't speak. He just stood beside him, close enough to share the warmth of presence, but not so close that it crowded the air between them. But tonight, Mr. Elridge went on, his voice barely more than a whisper. I slept 3 hours straight. I dreamed I was walking through a forest. Spencer didn't look at me, but he was walking beside me, and Callie was running ahead, laughing. Maybe for the first time in years, I remembered what it felt like to be a decent man. He turned toward Aiden, eyes glistening but dry. You've made me believe I might still have something to give. Not because of what I used to know, but because of what I can still offer, even if it's just silence, a colored piece of paper, or a look that doesn't judge. Aiden nodded. He didn't know what else to say. But in that moment, the two men stood side by side, one learning to accept the past, the other still trying to survive the present. And between them, there was no saving, no rescuing, just the quiet truth that together, they were a little less alone. 3 weeks after that night, when Mr. Elridge stood on Aiden's porch, an unfamiliar letter arrived. The envelope was thick and ivory-colored, the recipient's name written in sharp, elegant penmanship, Mr. Aiden Moore. In the upper corner was the name of an organization Aiden had never heard of, Global Institute of Psychological Connection, Community Healing Advisory Board. Beneath it, in smaller letters, read the line, On behalf of Honorary Advisor Harvey Elridge. Aiden opened the letter with a puzzled feeling. He remembered Mr. Elridge mentioning psychological organizations and youth support programs before, but he never imagined his own name would appear in the same letterhead as the old man's. Inside was an official invitation. Aiden had been nominated for a 2-year intensive training program in community psychological support, with full tuition, materials, and living expenses covered by a foundation bearing the name Harvey Elridge. Attached to the documents was a copy of a handwritten letter Mr. Elridge had sent to the board before he passed away. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted gently, as if still speaking between the lines. I've met hundreds of intelligent people in my life, people with degrees, reputations, and a talent for shaping words. But very few truly know how to sit in silence with someone else's pain without trying to fix it. Aiden Moore is one of them. He's never taken a mindfulness course, never studied therapy terms, but he understands. He can walk into a room and make others believe they don't have to be better. They just have to be seen. And sometimes that's all we need to keep living. Aiden read the letter all the way through, hardly daring to breathe. His hands trembled slightly as he turned to the last page, where Mr. Elridge had written, in clear, deliberate strokes, I leave behind no possessions. I leave behind trust. If I ever had any worth, I now place all of it in this man. He had to read it 3 times before the meaning truly sank in. Mr. Elridge had never been forgotten by the world. On the contrary, he had chosen to step away from it. When he was younger, he taught in renowned programs, authored several studies on adolescent trauma, and was regarded as one of the early pioneers of the presence-based therapy model. But after Spencer's death, he cut off all contact, declined every invitation, and withdrew, not to hide, but to listen. During his years at the nursing home, Mr. Elridge had quietly funded several projects, writing letters to young psychologists, making anonymous donations to community therapy groups in struggling areas. Yet he never signed his name on anything, never appeared at a single event. It wasn't until a few months before his death that he nominated someone, for the first and only time, Aidan Moore, to the board. Aidan sat frozen at the kitchen table, the letter still open in front of him, while Callie was in her room drawing a card that read, "Welcome back, Grandpa Harvey," in bright, colorful block letters. She didn't know what the letter said, but when she saw her father's expression change, she walked over and asked, "Is he okay?" Aidan shook his head gently. There were no tears, but his throat tightened. "He's gone, Callie," he said softly. "But he left something for me, something bigger than any gift." The funeral was held 3 days later. Just as Mr. Elridge had wished, there were only 3 people present: Aidan, Callie, and a staff member from the nursing home to represent them. No speeches, no flowers. Just an urn resting beside a monochrome photograph of Mr. Elridge, smiling faintly, his eyes not looking at the camera, but off into the distance, as if thinking of something left unsaid. Callie placed a drawing inside the urn, a picture of a silver-haired grandfather standing between 2 figures, one adult with an arm around his shoulder and a little girl holding his hand from the other side. At the top of the picture, in bright, uneven letters, it read, "I love you." Aidan didn't speak throughout the ceremony, but as he stood to leave, he turned back for one last look. In his mind echoed the words Mr. Elridge had said that night on the porch, "You've made me believe I still matter." Now Aidan understood. That belief had been passed on to him, not as a burden, but as a way to continue the unfinished kindness someone else once began. After the funeral, Aidan's life didn't change overnight. He still woke up early to make breakfast for Callie, still took on small repair jobs to keep the bills paid, still lived in that modest 2-room apartment where every corner was so familiar he could find the light switch with his eyes closed. But something inside him had shifted. Quietly, yet deeply. It was as if a part of him that had long been sealed shut from exhaustion had finally cracked open just enough for the wind to slip through. Aidan used the grant from the Harvey Elridge Foundation to enroll in a part-time program on community psychological support. The classes were held on weeknights and weekends for working adults. He wasn't great with theory, but he became one of the few students noted by his instructors as having an intuitive ability to connect with those in pain. Aidan never aimed to become an expert. He just wanted to understand more deeply the thing he had only ever known by instinct. Around that same time, Aidan began spending his weekends setting up a small space inside the neighborhood community center. He didn't call it a counseling room or a workshop. It was just a wide, welcoming room, with comfortable chairs, a corner for hot tea, a few boxes of children's toys, and a small sign by the door that read, "For fathers and for the children who need them to be present." The first people who came weren't strangers. There was the big security guard from the supermarket down the street who'd lost custody of his kids after a divorce. A young dad with his 3-year-old son who sat silently in a corner for hours, letting the boy play quietly. And an older father, newly retired, struggling to figure out how to connect with his granddaughter after his own daughter passed away. Aidan didn't run the meetings with any formal structure or curriculum. He just shared small stories about how Callie once got angry because she couldn't find her favorite sock, about the first time he tried reading a psychology book and couldn't make it past the first chapter, about how being a father didn't mean being perfect, just patient. In one corner, Callie had set up a little wooden board where she hung her drawing of Grandpa Harvey, an old man in a sweater standing next to someone holding a toolbox with a handwritten caption that read, "Thank you for being my dad's friend." Whenever another child asked, "Is that your grandpa?" Callie would answer seriously, "No, but he's the best friend my dad ever had." The space didn't promise miracles. It didn't heal people overnight, but it became a place where anyone could come, not to prove they were getting better, but simply to know they weren't alone in their struggle. A place where people could sit down without having to explain themselves. Aidan didn't think he was changing the world, but he knew he was keeping a promise no one had asked of him, yet it was clearer than anything he'd ever had before, the promise to keep giving what he once received, unconditional presence. Aidan's story doesn't end with a miracle. There's no award, no dazzling conclusion, only a man once brought to his knees by loss, who chose to stand again. And in standing, he remembered to reach a hand backward, so that if someone else ever stumbled in that same place, they'd know someone once fell there and still kept going. That's where today's story ends. Thank you for listening and staying with us until the very last moment. If you'd like to hear more real and meaningful stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. We truly look forward to seeing you again.